and welcome to the presentation for Immersive Literature by Sofia Klebnikov for the Design Informatics Projects course at the University of Edinburgh. This presentation will outline the design for a virtual reality experience. This design is meant as an educational tool and moral exercise to engage the user with literature, specifically writing and words. Both reading and virtual reality are isolating and personal activities. While engaging with literature is an inherently non-visual experience, and virtual reality is almost entirely dependent on visual presentation, this design will challenge the capabilities of both mediums by creating an immersive experience where the user must use reading in order to navigate the space. The foundation of this design is a specific work of literature. I chose Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written in 1886 by Robert Louis Stevenson, because of its descriptive nature and Scottish origin. The story describes Dr. Jekyll, who battles against his alter ego, Mr. Hyde, who represents man's animalistic and violent impulses. The book examines man's dual nature and the balance between good and evil in all of us. The construction and choreography of this virtual reality experience were heavily influenced by black and white cinema, particularly black and white surrealist film, such as Spellbound, made by Salvador Dali and Alfred Hitchcock in 1948. The dream sequences that use contrast, shadow, and simple geometric forms instead of color and texture were highly influential to the look of immersive literature. In order to create a space for the user to engage with words and reading, the environment is void of any color, texture, or concrete objects. It is a blank space inhabited only by writing. The user observes the environment and interacts with it by reading. The physical setting is articulated by words hanging in space. The biggest inspiration for this aesthetic is the film The Matrix, directed by the Wachowski brothers in 1999. Particularly, the scene where the visual world is peeled back to reveal code running through all the surfaces. Immersive literature would have a similar effect, where words form the fabric of the virtual environment, constantly moving and being rewritten, covering both the figures and the planes of the setting, creating a dynamic flow and exchange of information for the user to engage with. Rather than using lines of code, immersive literature will also take inspiration from the work of Jim Sanborn from 2004, where he uses simple shadow and light displays to create a hallway made up of lines of text. Sanborn successfully combines reading with physical movement, encouraging the viewer to walk through a space in order to absorb all the information and read each line. Although the words will not wrap around specific surfaces in the virtual experience, they will act almost as pages of text molded over invisible objects. The writing used in the virtual reality experience will be quoted directly from Stevenson's text. In the story, many scenes are repeated and retold from different perspectives, continuing the theme of dual nature and opposing forces of good and evil. Each character is described with both positive and negative aspects. Here are some examples of phrases used to describe Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and the city of London where the story takes place. The setting created by the words hanging in air will resemble ghostly architecture, similar to the work of Edoardo Tresoldi in 2017. The lack of detail allows the user to fully immerse themselves in the act of reading and engaging with words, rather than be influenced by any objects. The use of architecture and the model of a London street encourages the user to move through the space physically and not stand still and read from a fixed point. In addition to providing a passage for the user to walk, the setting of a London street will be divided in half based on word placement. Descriptions from the text describing London will be categorized and distributed to these two sections. One side will be composed of quotes describing Dr. Jekyll's world of refinement, wealth, order, and society, while the other will reflect Mr. Hyde's nightmarish habitat of crowds, fog, mystery, and violence. This juxtaposition mimics the major themes of the text about conflicting impression and perception. As the user moves down the London street, they will encounter the figures of the two titular characters, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The figures are modeled after the photography of Tracy Martin in her work Projection Project, as well as that by Nota Bene Visual Group in Order to Control from 2011. The figures are blank bodies working as canvases for the words that describe them. Here's the first example of a prototype head for the figure of Mr. Hyde. It is wrapped in adjectives and descriptive phrases taken directly from the text. Positive and negative quotes are blended together. Just as with the words that define the street scene, the words on this figure ripple and rewrite themselves in a dynamic flow of quotation. Here is another prototype head for Mr. Hyde, covered in different words. The ones shown on this head are stronger and more centered around physicality. The interpretation of the figures change depending on the words that cover them. Mr. Hyde is often described by other characters as a monster, but Dr. Jekyll, who transforms into him, envies his freedom. The juxtaposition of the character is reflected in the mingling of both positive and negative descriptors on the figure's surface. Here is a prototype for the figurehead of Dr. Jekyll. Compared to that of Mr. Hyde, the words are overall more positive, and they directly reflect his values as a gentleman and a man of science. In addition to being encased in writing, the figures will also have sound emanating from them in the form of whispers, describing their physicality and actions through quotations from the text. The use of an audio component engages the user further and encourages them to move about the figures and get closer in order to hear the dialogue clearly. It also references the storytelling aspect of literature and adds a further layer of emphasis on the words themselves. The full-body prototype of Dr. Jekyll's figure shows the conflicted vocabulary that can be used to describe him. Although he is a man of science who is respected by his peers, he is also restricted by society and constantly worried about his reputation and the judgment of others. The user's physical movement throughout the scene is vital and causes reactions in the virtual environment around them. Drawing closer to one figure causes a transformation in the other. The words of the second figure shift to harsh judgment and condemnations. For example, if the user physically draws closer to the figure of Mr. Hyde, the words on the surface of Dr. Jekyll's figure would reveal more of his anxiety and enslavement to the rules of conduct. And if the user were to draw closer to Dr. Jekyll, a transformation would come over the figure of Mr. Hyde and paint him as a truly evil force. This is an example of the figure of Mr. Hyde in a neutral state. There's a mix of vocabulary that references his terrifying qualities, but also the passion and liberation that his character evokes. Here is an example of the figure of Mr. Hyde, once the user has moved over to Dr. Jekyll's side of the scene. The graphic style of the words that cover his body change to match the written accusations. Certain words grow bigger to become brands across his whole body and obscure the smaller descriptors that give him nuance. The figure becomes more one-dimensional as the user indulges in the perspectives of the other characters. In addition to the words covering the figures reacting to the user's movements about the scene, as time progresses in the experience, the architecture of the London street will also begin to change as the user navigates between the two sides. The movement in the urban landscape is inspired by the work of Rafik Anadol, who creates AI-generated landscape montages, such as this one with the buildings of Stockholm entitled Latent History. Once the user has entered into the virtual environment, traversed the street, and begun to interact with the two figures, the division between the words on the right and left-hand side of the street, bearing positive and negative descriptions respectively, will no longer be reinforced. However, once the user begins to move between the figures and the architecture is affected, the set will take on aspects of one or the other description. The physical layout of the London streets that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde inhabit take on drastically different tones depending on which character is moving through the space. The physical transformation that will occur within the virtual environment will still be made up of words hanging in space, but the scale, angles, and volume of the masses created by these words will change. Dr. Jekyll's version of London is elegant, polished, wealthy, social, and orderly, whereas Mr. Hyde inhabits a darker, jumbled, looming, and chaotic version of the city. These landscapes will appear in response to the user's movement between the two figures, as it is up to the user to decide which city to exit through to leave the virtual experience. The decision is marked by the climax of the whispering voices emanating from both figures that will get louder and louder over time until whichever figure whose side the user is on at the end of the experience, finally yells out the last word. Immersive literature is a virtual experience designed to mirror the narrative process. Rather than concrete images, setting, and objects, the user encounters words that form a world around them. Reading and moving is their mode of gathering information. It is still an isolated experience, but allows the user to physically navigate, as well as emotionally and mentally engage with the story and its contents. The set design and layout of the experience mirrors the narrative themes of dual nature and divided personality. Immersive literature is still confronting the user with words to be processed, but also forcing them to become involved in the narrative by making a moral and interpretive decision in order to exit the experience. This now concludes the presentation of immersive literature. Thank you for listening.